She's senior researcher of the Department of Lexicology, Lexicography, and Structural Mathematic Linguistics of the Institute of the Ukrainian Language of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Her scientific interests include word formation and lexicology of the modern Ukrainian language. Her co-presenter is our own Svitlana Melnyk. Svitlana is a senior lecturer in Slavic and East European languages and cultures at Indiana University. She received her Kandidat Nauk in philology at Kiev National Taras Shevchenko University. Here at Indiana University, Svitlana teaches courses in Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture, as well as advanced intermediate Russian, business Russian, and Russian for the social sciences. She has many research interests, including language policy in Ukraine and its implementation in the sphere of education. Larysa and Svitlana's paper this morning is entitled "The Impact of the War on the Language Activities of the Ukrainian Community and the Ukrainian Language System." So obviously a very important and timely topic. Before I hand the floor over to you, Larysa and Svitlana, I want to make sure that we're recording this wonderful session and that's okay with all of the presenters. I've asked Daniel to record in the English channel. Svitlana, will you be able to record in the Ukrainian channel, or should I try to do that?
Я вже почала.
Добре. Okay, so Svitlana, Larysa, the floor is yours, please.
Дуже дякую. Дозвольте мені
Дякую. І, шановні колеги, насамперед,
Thanks a lot. And I would like to express my appreciation to our wonderful team in Indiana University for supporting Ukrainian scholars during this difficult time for us. And thanks to Professors Sarah Phillips and Taras Valentina and Svitlana Melnyk for organizing this three-day Shevchenko conference. So, during the previous lecture, you can see the slide on the screen. I talked about how Ukrainian society lives through trauma, and Ukrainian culture is one of the ways to tackle it. And this shared presentation with Svitlana in order to process influence of war. We are using concept of language innovation and language trends. We're talking about trans as synonym to synchronous dynamic. It was offered by German linguist Karl Gottschmidt in a comparative aspect. And there are Ukrainian linguists. They used it as part of a single language framework to describe different processes of language development and different functional styles. You can see different links, references to these works. The process and how the language, how the war influences the language has different trends. And unfortunately, we don't have much time, but we will study two different areas: racialization and nationalization as using autonomous symbols and means. We're analyzing texts of 2022, 2023, publicistic and fictional style, and Svitlana will talk about conversational style. So we've studied social media, non-fiction, fiction, and text by 50 authors about war, about martial law, published by Chernivtsi Publishing House. And you can see the cover to that book. So the book's name is Martial Law. It was so the welcome word was made by Mr. Zaluzhny, and he compares Ukraine with a fortress, and you can see Ukrainian forces language on the cover. So the trend of internationalization in Ukraine, it's represented by different loan words and hybrid derivatives. For example, names of weapons, and there are words that represent different types of weapons like застінгерити, забайрактарити, also different hybrid nouns like гранатопад, безпілотникопад, шахедолови, and you can see some examples of these words on the slides. Before fall 2022, so blackout was a word they used to call like a curtain for light isolation, or maybe like a blackout as a people losing consciousness. But during the fall blackout, it started to mean electricity blackout. I will just cite one of the last examples. When they turn on the light in the middle of the night, if I had blackout in my childhood, my Tamagotchi would die. I would stick my hands to the radiator. Do you know how the radiator rattles in the middle of the night? It's probably those Ukrainian speakers would probably understand allusion to Pavlo Tychina's poem. The trend of nationalization also includes, is related to a spiritual life of Ukrainians. There are different analogies Ukrainians use. For example, Holodomor. Holodomor is similar to Holodomor as a genocide of Ukrainian nation through artificial mass starvation organized by the Soviet leadership in 1932-1933. And the lack of heat in high buildings in 2022-23 was called genocide by cold, or Holodomor, is the deliberate creation of living conditions for an ethnic group that are designed to completely or partially destroy it physically. Examples of functioning of that new term are shown on this slide. Pavlo Korobchuk's poems, which he wrote in Kiev without electricity, communication, and internet, also contain images that echo the meme, recharge is the most important thing. Warm yourself against the orbital motion of the planet. Only hugs are left of warmth. Only hope is left of light. There is nothing left, only faith. The new word fire baptism, or Вогнехреща, was created by analogy to Epiphany, Водохреща, holiday in the Christmas cycle on January 19. The word appeared during the events of the Revolution of Dignity and denoted the confrontation on Khrushchevsko Street in Kiev from January 19 to 2014, when the hot phase of the confrontation began. And the word actually a document film of the same name presented in January 2022. The word of the fire baptism was actualized in January 2023 during the fierce battles near Bakhmut, which were presented in the report. Referring to the text of literature classics of Ukrainian literature is also one of the manifestations of the trend of nationalization and fusion. As in the allusion in the drawing by Yuri журавль, beyond Bayraktar after Bayraktar, and there are steps and the grave, like in Shevchenko's poem in the Casemate, be like a ravine after a ravine. Quoting poetry and stylizing it as Shevchenko's poetry during the war is not an isolated incident. It's not just a single phenomenon. And armed forces soldiers tore off the occupiers' propaganda poster from a billboard and saw a poem by Taras Shevchenko. There are also modern texts about the war stylized as Shevchenko's poems, such as paraphrased lines from the poem The Dream. You can see the original in the first column, which became a public reaction to the strike on the Crimean Bridge in October 2022. This bridge was illegally built by the occupying Russian authorities, which led to its fire and its partial destruction. This is the author's text by Marina Tsygankova in the second column, and a version from the SBU, from the Ukrainian National News channel. From the Kazakh Anecdotes website. And the appeal of Ukrainians to their cultural and historical roots expressed in language turns out to be a powerful component of Ukrainian identity and threat to the nation's, in times of challenge and threat to the nation's existence. This is confirmed by the actualization of Vasyl Kasyan's poster from the Second World War, which replaced the fascist occupiers with Russist occupiers. So I give the floor to Svitlana. Thank you, Larysa. I will continue the topic of the war's impact on language by focusing on the colloquial style. The textual material is taken from social media and websites, in particular public posts and comments on Facebook, materials from Telegram, videos from YouTube and TikTok, interviews with our defenders, or short videos of their everyday life. As Serhiy Zhadan noted on the occasion of being awarded by the German book publishers, war undoubtedly changes the language, its architecture, and the field of its functioning. The inability to use the usual mechanism, or rather the inability of previous peaceful pre-war constructions to convey your state, to explain your rage, pain, and hope, it is especially painful and unbearable. It turns out that the possibilities of language are limited by new circumstances and new landscape, a landscape that is written in the space of death, the space of catastrophe. However, this limitation creates new opportunities for language creation. If there are no words, they can be invented, can be created. In the language practice of Ukrainians, we can observe the creation of different hybrid words with the help of autochthonous and borrowed elements, the emergence of new meanings or neo-Semitisms, new idiomatic compounds. In addition, there are code switching, the use of elements of the Russian language, semantic ambiguity, violations of language norms, the use of rude and disrespectful vocabulary, and excessive use of obscene vocabulary. In the creation of reduced sarcastic names, in particular hybrid nouns for the enemy, the use of occasional word formation in language plays evident. You probably know these words: mortar, orcs, orchistan, laptistan, and so on. These examples can be continuous with new words using analogy and telescopic creation. I mean, combining the beginning of the word and the end of the second word, which reflect the attitude of Ukrainians towards the aggressor. You know these words: putler, Jugend, press, alkoshe, Kremladi or Krem horse, and so on. These negative words. There are examples, these are examples of the deconstruction of Russian propaganda and casual nominations in the manifestation of the nationalization trends. Specific elements are used in different ways of creating occasional noun names of persons with expressive evaluative potential. Bonevtik, Moskolota, Pochekun, Zhdanek, Zhigulята. The dismissive attitude towards the enemy is reflected in code switching when speakers insert Russianisms to emphasize a mocking attitude, for example, победовесие, поребрик, even using this intonation. Semantic ambiguity is manifested in the creation of new meanings through a different word division. Recently, I've noticed Ramzan Kadyrov so you can see this the different meaning of the word. During the war, Ukrainian phraseology was enriched with transformed and new phraseological expressions that combine octatonous and borrowed elements, use wordplay, allusions, and intertextuality. For example, Hunger Games, about the situation with grain exports. Carthagena, landlords, climate and climate, Palyanica. So the Ukrainian language resistance in times of war is characterized by what is known as a grassroots spontaneous laugh culture. I recently watched an interview with one of our defenders, codenamed Beard from the Freedom Legion. He said, without humor, you can go crazy. So humor is resistance, stress management, and a means of defense, as the author of the publication in honor of Larysa Kysliuk noted. In times of war, language turns into a weapon. The humor of Ukrainian people has become a kind of Semitic air defense that helps to defend against Russian propaganda and preserve the strength of spirit. Therefore, the modern language practice of Ukrainians is characterized by the appeal to the traditions of Ukrainian laugh culture, or folklore elements, anecdotes, or jokes, such as, "Dad, what is quiet dawn?" Son, that's Kadyrov, banked up with earth. So it's a play on the title of Sholokhov's novel and the derogatory name of the Chechen military leader. Some of the memes are based on interlingual English-Ukrainian homonymy, for example, English troops and Ukrainian trupy, or dead bodies, like you can see on the slide. So come on, how do you say Ukrainian Russian troops in English? Russian troops. God, it sounds so good. Another example is gratitude for Leopard tanks for Ukraine, expressed in English, thank you, or tankeshön, with a play on the similarity of spelling. Such examples confirm not only the interdependence of internalization and nationalization trends, but also their interpenetration, a certain fusion through language play and wartime speech. And Taras Shevchenko's works, as well as his image, is actualized by Ukrainians in times of great trials. And since 2014 until now, quotes from his works on memes, fight and you will overcome, God helps you, and sprinkle the enemy's evil blood on your freedom. It's allusion to the quote, when they come, bury them. Як придута закопайте. Creation of memes of Shevchenko as an armed forces soldier wearing a helmet and carrying a javelin or sniper rifle, or as a Leon the killer from Luc Besson's film with Lesya Ukrainka as Batilda. It was a reference to Western culture and a new manifestation of the internalization trend, which was not observed before and which became more pronounced during the war, due to the strong support of Ukraine by the international community. It deserves special attention. It is a change in the vector of internalization, namely the penetration of elements of the Ukrainian language into English. This is facilitated by social media, press, and commercial websites. For example, the well-known online dictionary website uses words and phrases of colloquial speech and slang, like an Urban Dictionary website, records words related to the Russian-Ukrainian war, with lexemes about Russia having negative connotations, such as Russism or Rusnya, which exists in two different spelling variants, as well as Putler, and the other words is quite derogatory. I'm not going to say that. Instead, lexemes referring to Ukraine are used in the positive sense. So the dictionary uses words like bavovna, bavovnyatko. You can just look at these articles. They're quite popular. There is a word palyanica. So we got used to it. And also slava Ukraini, or glory to Ukraine in English. Ukrainian farm or Ukrainian tractor pull. And two last words, Ukrained. So take a look at that. Ukrained and the phrase Ukrainian tractor pull. They don't have actual translation into Ukrainian. You can see that it says when you are Russia and you invade the country, and the response is humiliation in a global form. And Taras Kremen, our language ombudsman, he translates it as "Uzukrainit." Actually, this word has more likes on the website. Similarly, Ukrainian language doesn't have translation for Ukrainian tractor pull. There is a similar word which is like перетягування російських танків, but it's not really the same. And also, I'd like to say that Ukrainian language is also penetrating English-speaking society through the commercialization of certain products. For example, on the Amazon website, you can find merchandise in English and Ukrainian, meaning that Ukrainian lexemes become recognizable symbols or markers and codes, and primarily due to the autochthonous images and images with which they are combined. The most recognizable one is Taras Shevchenko. They have pillows with Shevchenko's words, fight and you will win, t-shirts and hoodies, a metal plate with the word of Shevchenko's will, and sell phone cases in yellow and blue with the quotation, love all you black-browed ladies, кохайтеся чорноброві та не з москалями. Similarly, yeah.
We're really
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you
Yes.
so much.
Yes, sure. Так, звичайно.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, Etsy website offers stickers, mugs, and t-shirts, and even a Taras Shevchenko doll. Okay, we'll just switch to the last slide. So we can see that internalization and interpenetration trends in language. We can observe a change in the vector of the internalization trend as memes and neologisms of the Russian-Ukrainian war become the property of English-speaking culture. The change in the vector aimed at exporting Ukrainian words to the English-speaking environment is an essential feature of the modern period. Thank you for your attention. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Well, we try to shorten it as much as possible.
Presentation, so much great and very rich material. I hope we'll have time to discuss it. We do have limited time this morning, so I'm so sorry that we can't continue with this paper, but let's move on to Ivanna Tsar, our next speaker. I'll introduce Ivanna very quickly. She's been working as a researcher in the Department of Stylistics, Language, Culture, and Sociolinguistics of the Institute of Ukrainian Language of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine in the Sociolinguistics group since November 2017. She studied at the Ivan Franko Lviv National University and undertook postgraduate studies at the Institute of the Ukrainian Language of the National Academy of Sciences. Her paper this morning or this afternoon is entitled Transformation of the Linguistic Behavior of Ukrainian Youth in the Context of a Full-Scale War. So thank you so much, Ivanna. We're really looking forward to hearing your paper, and the floor is yours.
Шановні колеги, хвилинку спробуємо підключити.
Just a minute, I'm trying to connect my screen. Please tell me if you can see the slides okay and if they move.
See your slides. Do you want to move them?
Так, не перемикаються.
Are they switching? Are they changing?
Only seeing the first slide.
Зараз перемикаються, так?
Yes, yes. Mhm.
Is it
Yeah.
okay now?
Колеги, насамперед, я щиро
Thank you, dear colleagues. First of all, I'm sincerely grateful for the opportunity to take part in this great program and this conference. And the topic of my presentation is related to the linguistic behavior, Ukrainian youth in the context of a full-scale war, namely the transformation of this linguistic behavior. So, as you know, the language issue in Ukraine has always been politically manipulated by Russia and those who supported Russia. Even said the language issue was one of the reasons for them to begin this cruel war, and it is understandable that under these conditions, the attitude of Ukrainians to Ukrainian and Russian language has changed. Social linguists, they mention the increasing tendency of increasing of the prestige of Ukrainian language after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014 and the start of the war between Russia and Ukraine. But after the full-scale invasion in February 24 last year, the language situation has been changing even more rapidly. The journalists, sociologists, linguists, they started documenting people, not only ethnic Ukrainians, resigning Russian language as a mother tongue. And today we will try to characterize the changes in linguistic behaviors of young Ukrainians under the influence of the Russia-Ukrainian War of 2022 and already 23. And also we will try to compare it to the changes that we have seen for 9 years of the war before the full-scale invasion. And in order to do this, we have worked on 5 linguistic biographies of young people. We have recorded 1 hour biographies and also 20 language biographies of young internal migrants, IDPs, recorded before February 24th, and also 80 short interviews plus an associative experiment that were carried out after February 24, 2022. I would like to emphasize that this is not a quantitative study. We're not meaning to be statistically significant, but we're looking for tendencies in linguistic behavior, and we're also looking at social and psychological background of these changes. And before we start analyzing linguistic behavior of youth under current conditions, I would ask you to look at this slide. This is a small amount of results of the associative experiments that I'm carrying out together with recording linguistic biography. So as you see, for those who think that Ukrainian is their mother tongue, Russian language is now associated with something negative. It's war, aggression, disgust, red color, something from the past. And Ukrainian is associated with freedom, with nightingales, something that is native. And the thoughts of those informants who said that Russian was a native language, they divided. For some of them, Russian language is just a means of communication, and for the others, it is the language of the enemy. And it is interesting that Ukrainian for them primarily associates with school and something official. Of course, here we can discuss that not everybody who thinks that Ukrainian is their mother tongue indeed use it as a mother tongue, as well as it is true for those who say that Russian is their mother tongue. This is something that needs to be further studied. And I'm citing you these several examples so that you would know how our informants see both languages right now. This will help us understand the reasons of changes in their behavior. How Ukrainian youth communicates, I have generalized it in 5 groups that you may see here on the slide. So first group, only Ukrainian communication. They do not switch to Russian in conversations with Russian-speaking people, so they maintain linguistic stability. The second group talk in Ukrainian, but they can switch to Russian in conversation with Russian speakers. The third group uses Ukrainian and Russian depending on the situation. The fourth group talks in Russian, but can switch to Ukrainian depending on the situation. And there is also the fifth group that uses only Russian for communication and never switches to Ukrainian. So they also maintain linguistic stability. And of course, there is also youth who uses surjik, the mixture of Russian and Ukrainian, but I have not identified it separately because there are many psychological nuances there, and this is a separate topic for study. So how the language behavior of these people in these groups has changed after full-scale invasion, the most noticeable change we have observed of informants in the first and the fifth group. The informants that have maintained linguistic stability and have never switched to Russian before started reacting more acutely, more rudely to the linguistic questions. They are having cases that earlier people could maintain a two-language conversation when both people were using their language and understanding each other. They started asking the Russian language person, asking them to switch to Ukrainian and showing that they don't understand Russian. And for people from this group, it is important whether the person they are talking to is a Ukrainian or an ethnic Russian. There are examples when even Ukrainian speakers who could switch to Russian earlier, when understood that they were talking to a Russian, understanding that they don't know Ukrainian. After last year's event, after this year's event, they stopped taking this into account, which is related to negative attitude to Russians themselves. For these respondents, the issue of language became even more the issue of principle, and they started asking people they are talking to switch to Ukrainian. And they're showing that they don't understand other languages. What is important in the most biographies that we have analyzed, we have not identified any resistance or conflict that Russian propaganda is always talking about. If people are not switching to Russian now, it's not viewed as discrimination, but rather as expressing their linguistic rights and as resisting Russian aggression. Even more, we have documented the examples of respondents from this group. The first group are getting irritated when the Russian speakers are trying to show how pro-Ukrainian they are, but are not switching to Ukrainian language to communicate. For instance, Yulia, a manager in the accessory shop in Lviv, says this: they hung themselves with blue and yellow ribbons because they're afraid of Bandera, and they come and say, do you have a yellow-blue ribbon in Russian? And I tell them right away, no. And I think that I don't sell blue and yellow ribbons to such people. And there are examples when the Ukrainian language people from this group, they try to get rid of the Russian words. They're trying to speak more pure Ukrainian and get rid of Surzhyk as well. The informants from the second and third groups also started reacting differently to the language issue. They stopped, some of them switching to Russian. Some of them say that they would like to use only Ukrainian, but subconsciously, without control, they switch to the other language. For instance, Taras from Kyiv says, sometimes I mostly used Russian for communication and I started using Ukrainian, and now I'm trying to use only Ukrainian because the enemy is talking in Russian. If they want to understand us, they need to learn Ukrainian. For the other informants from this group, Russian language, as much as the Ukrainian language, is only a means of communication. And to use both languages, depending on the situation, for them is a usual everyday thing. This position is illustrated by the example below. Ivan from Lutsk says, my attitude towards Russian has changed, but not radically. It is necessary to reduce its use in everyday life, but it is not necessary to radically not read, listen, perceive the language. We still have a lot of primary Russian sources in scientific language literature, which also have a place in the scientific sphere, except the sources with propaganda that we cannot perceive as reliable sources in science. The informants from the two latter groups, they either try to switch to Ukrainian entirely or try to increase the amount of Ukrainian in their everyday life. They aspire to better the Ukrainian language. Some of them attend language courses, or on principle, they do not change their linguistic behavior, and they say that language isn't guilty, language doesn't guarantee safety, and that Ukrainian is being forced on them. Some of them said that they faced language discrimination in Ukraine. Nastya from Mariupol says, I hate it that they're making me change the language to Ukrainian. It is more convenient for me to do that. But even those people who use Russian, that plan to continue to speak Russian, they say that Russian is just a means of communication. They perceive Russian language separately from the Russian people, that they have negative attitude to. Many informants from the three latter groups, they used to post on their social media in Russian, and now they started doing that in Ukrainian. On this slide, actually, you can see parts from language biographies of people who switch to Ukrainian or change their attitude to Ukrainian because of the war. The second example is especially interesting. This is a girl from Sevastopol, a Crimean Tatar. She's trying to switch to Ukrainian completely. She is not using any Russian content anymore, although she lives in the Russian-speaking environment. This is Kamila, she's 17, and publicly she must use Russian. But she says that she watches movies, series, and listens to music in Ukrainian. She tries to read book in Ukrainian. She cannot explain it, but Russian is just disgusting to her. It's difficult for her psychologically. So you've seen how the language behavior of young people is changing today. In addition, I analyzed the biographies of young Russian-speaking IDPs from Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast and Crimea that were recorded before the full-scale invasion. And the events of 2014 and of the 9-year war have also impacted their language behavior, but more their attitude to the languages than their everyday communication. The darker is the color here on the slide, the worse is the situation with the Ukrainian language. As you may see, almost all the informants said that they can switch to Ukrainian, but at the same time, most of them continued to use Russian in everyday life because they realized that in Kyiv they can live without Ukrainian. This was about Kyiv, but they could switch their language codes in shops, on the transport, so in outside communication. You can see it on slide. They use Ukrainian the least on the internet, but now the situation on the internet is changing as well. There are many bloggers with many million audiences that are popular with the youth. They started posting content in Ukrainian now. And many young people now who used to say that they are ready to switch to Ukrainian, but they need some kind of a motivation, they have finally received this kind of motivation. And there's a certain chain of change in linguistic behavior, especially for youth. Almost everybody said that they know some people who entirely switched to Ukrainian. And one of our respondents not only switched himself, but even his mother, who is technically a Russian, also switched to Ukrainian completely. So here you have several brief conclusions that we can make from this study of language biographies. First is the clear perception of the Russian language as the language of the enemy, and it influenced the strengthening of the language stability of Ukrainian-speaking youth and also contributed to the change in the language behavior of those who mainly or always communicated in Russian. The number of Ukrainian language content on YouTube and other social networks popular among young people has increased, and often young people try to demonstrate their Ukrainian position to the others, and they start running their pages on social networks in Ukrainian, replying to comments in Ukrainian, and so on. And even if in real life, they continue to communicate in Russian. And also Russian-speaking youth who believe that the language is not to blame for anything, they defiantly continue to communicate. Of course, not always, but often defiantly continue to communicate in Russian and do not switch to Ukrainian, even if they could do so before. So we can assume that the number of bilingual communicative situations will increase when each of the people talking will be talking in their own language and not switching to the language of their counterpart. This is only part of the results. The study is still ongoing, so we can be certain about the results when the situation stabilizes more or less. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ivana, excuse me, thank you so much for this really wonderful presentation. Again, such great material, and I hope we'll have time to discuss it and get some comparative views on it as well. So thank you very much. Moving on to our third paper in this session, another co-authored paper. The first author is Oksana Sukhovii. She is a docent at the Kyiv National University of Taras Shevchenko. Oksana conducts research in the fields of dialectology and the history of the Ukrainian language from various directions. including research and publication of the handwritten sermons of Varlam Yasnitsky from the 17th century, the implementation of dialectological expeditions and description of individual expressions of the Ukrainian language on the territory of Ukraine and beyond, for example, Moldova, and research on Ukrainian historical phraseology, publication of manuals for university students on the history of the Ukrainian language in co-authorship. The second author on this paper is Indiana University's Miriam Shrager. Masha is senior lecturer at the Slavic and East European Languages and Cultures Department at Indiana University and an adjunct in the Linguistics Department. She has many specialties, including Russian folk tales, Russian and Soviet film, Old Church Slavonic, etc. And her research interests include linguistics, historical and comparative Slavic and general linguistics, Slavic dialectology, and as I mentioned, folklore and cinema. The very interesting paper that I in particular am looking forward to as a disability studies scholar that Oksana and Masha will present today is entitled "The Structure of Nouns Denoting People with Disabilities in Ukrainian and its Neighboring Languages." So Miriam, Oksana, please take it away. The floor is yours.
Дякуємо. Почне Маша, будь ласка.
Thank you very much. We're going to start. Masha, the floor is yours.
Okay, sorry, I was muted. Okay, so first, I want to take this opportunity to thank all the organizers for this wonderful, very interesting conference, and for the opportunity to work with a scholar overseas as in cooperation. It was a wonderful work, wonderful experience of cooperation. We enjoyed it both, I think, and that's the most important. So I will just start with the introduction. That will be our, and then Oksana will take on, and I will just summarize. Okay, I'll start with English. She will be doing Ukrainian, and then I'll finish with English. That's how our cooperation. Great. Okay, so our initial goal in this paper was to compare word derivational suffixes across Slavic languages. But the material was so immense and huge that then later we decided to narrow our task and concentrate only on suffixes that are forming words denoting people with physical disabilities. As we conducted our research across dialects, we came across interesting formations, not only for words denoting people with disabilities, but also for words that describe some other physical peculiarities. And in this analysis, we will, and then we narrowed to 13 words. Eventually, it's only 2 words for this short presentation. So in this analysis, we will concentrate only on 2 words that are representatives of these 2 categories, one denoting people with disabilities, and another one another word representative of people with some notable physical marker, which is considered notable for the speakers of the dialect, but not for the standard languages. Okay, just a second. So I just want to say that this topic is unfortunately became relevant in connection to the recent war. As a result of the Russian invasion and bombardment.
Masha, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Are you meaning to advance the slides, or are
No,
you?
no, not
Okay.
yet.
Okay,
Yes,
sorry.
yes. In a minute. This topic, I'm saying that this topic is unfortunately connected to this recent war and is very relevant. As a result of this Russian invasion and bombardments, there will be more people with disabilities, and there could be future linguistic research that will be able to address this issue from a different point of view, of which I will mention at the end. Okay, and so now I am transferring the talk to Oksana, my colleague, and in Ukrainian, please.
Thanks a lot. І я продовжу українською. Отже,
And I'll continue presenting in Ukrainian. So when with Mrs. Shrager, we worked with the dictionary of dialect words. We looked that there are many words to denote deaf people, and so it was quite interesting for us to look whether there were a lot of word formation models to denominate other physical disabilities, and how these suffixes are perceived, whether it's neutral or whether it's being looked down upon, and whether it is the same for different Slavic languages. We worked with the dictionaries of Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, partially Polish languages, and we identified 12, 13 lexemes that denote a person with a certain physical disability. But there were so many models of word formation that for this presentation, we are talking about words denoting people with deafness as a physical disability and left-handed people as a noticeable physical characteristic. So these nouns are formed to identify some deviation from the norm, especially in the dialect. And these words are quite varied. And when we talk about people that have physical disabilities, there are many words, глухий, сліпий, косоокий, кривоногий, криворукий, that are used to talk about people with notable characteristics that deviate from the norm. And the attitude to people with objective physical deformity, it may be said that it's quite cruel. In the people, we can observe it when we look at the nouns signifying a dead person. The dialectology dictionaries, they always say that these words are derogatory. In every one of the languages that we studied, there are up to 30 words like that, but the most expressive words we observe in the Russian language. Most often, the dictionary says that this word is derogatory. In Ukrainian language, we have the words like glushpeta, also is something derogatory. And the lowest stylistic connotation can be explained with two things. First of all, these words are mostly about the person who has not lost their hearing completely, so only partially they are deaf, or so this person, they can hear when they're being talked to. I apologize, just a moment. For instance, it's like talking to a wall, to our Hlushman, or talking about a person who do not answer the question on time. Also, these words are used. And also, second reason, Praslavic word, if we use the etymology dictionary, the word of deaf and stupid are often quite close. And in this way, the person with limited hearing is perceived as a person with limited mental ability. For instance, in Lemke dialect, say something as if you're deaf is to talk as if you don't quite understand what you're saying. So we're perceiving the deaf person as a stupid person. Also, the second part of composite nouns, I apologize, it's a bit of the wrong order on the slide, but in Russian, we have this composite nouns, and we can see words here: глухомятка, глухоперя, глухопятина, глухопяча, глухопячина, глухохоня, глухтетеря. So much rare, it is observed in Belarusian, for instance, глухомань is associated with the space notion that has been, according to Mykola Shansky, borrowed from the Russian language. Ukrainian and Russian languages, they do not have the composite nouns to denote deaf people. And in the words that denote deaf people, we can have the interchangeable consonants and also sometimes vowels. I suggest that you now look at the words that convey the meaning of a deaf person in different languages. So you see that Polish language is only partially analyzed. Here on the left is Ukrainian, and then you have Belarusian and Russian. There are many words to say that someone is a deaf person, and all of that is due to using different word formation models. So let us look at these suffixes. We can observe here that only some forms between the dialects of the languages that we analyze are used in all the languages. For all languages, an suffix is common. Also for Russian and Belarusian, ar and man is also used jointly. So mostly each language has their own means to convey these meanings. Only in Ukrainian language, there are suffixes as meha, pet, and some others. So accordingly, these words, we can see them here, hlushpet, hlushpetka. A number of words to denote a person with a physical disability. For some reason, in dialects, there is also a left-handed person. And if deafness isn't objectively a physical disability, that partially limits what a person can do in their everyday life, then being a left-handed is only imaginary disability. But we have that common people have a different perception. Vitaly Zhaiveron writes, the ethnic linguist writes about this. It is associated with something not good, animus. You know, if you hear something in your left ear, it is a bad sign. If you get up from the left foot, it is also a bad sign. You cannot eat with the left hand, and so on and so forth. The opposition of right and left is well studied in linguistics because in pra-Slavic language and most likely in pra-Indo-European language, it was not only about the spatial opposition, but also about the opposition of something that is right, something that direct, something that is just, corresponding to the word right, and also something that is wrong, something that is unjust, something that is false, corresponding to left. This is Fassmer and Bruckner dictionary, also the ethnological dictionary of Ukrainian language, and so on. So in people's perception, something that's left is something that's wrong. And there is some people's paranomy was that. I apologize. I don't know. So for instance, Ukrainian has two left hands, or both his hands are left hands. How can this lefty have a good writing? We can see here also a negative attitude on Bukovina in Belarusian. How do you expect me to throw a stone far? I'm a lefty. In Russian also there is an example with a distinctly negative connotation. To denote a left-handed person, they use three roots: liv, lev in Belarusian, in Polish lev, also shulch, shui left, which or pra-Indo-European, someone who had his right hand cut. So the person doesn't have a right hand. So this is a person who is not complete. Or also there's a root mank, which is borrowed from Polish. Manka, leva ręka, left hand. And we see here a quote that refers to Latin mancus, someone who is weak, who is not complete, who is disabled. And we see that in contemporary language, the perception is entirely different. So look at how many words we have to denote a left-handed person. I would like to remind you that for notions that are talking about the norm, it is not that varied, only if it's deviating from the norm. The word formation gets so varied. It's 2 columns for Ukrainian, and then it's Belarusian, Russian, and Polish accordingly.
You can see that there are other similar words in Russian, Polish language, or Belarusian and Polish language. You can see around 50 lexemes that denote left-handed, excluding phonetical, or including like feminine and masculine nouns. And we just had a number of dictionaries to process. And in some of in dialects of different languages, these can be quite derogatory. No dictionary has words for left language people that are diminutive, whether Russian has it, using suffixes un or sun are denote words that are rude. And including different dialects. Word form modal normally represented by 2-component creation, the root of the word plus suffix, livak, and so on. Sometimes this suffix is invisible in the modern language. For example, livsha, manya, but it can be represented in historical linguistics using reconstruction. The modal is this: livsha, li, vsh. We've got a suffix, man. Sorry, I lost the slide. Another modal root plus suffix and plus suffix livashnik. Also, there are composite nouns: livashtan, livorochnik, livoroshnik. There are 3 of them. In Belarusian language, there is only a suffixal modal. In Russian language, it's mostly suffixal, and also a composite word livoruch. Literary language is more tolerant towards people with physical disabilities, unlike dialects. In the dialects of all of the languages under comparison, left-handedness, along with deafness, dumbness, blindness, and crippling disabilities, is perceived as a disability. But in the modern world, there's a different sort of attitude, right? And this is evidenced by the presence of suffixes that convey the meaning of contempt, insult, and swearing. In all the language under comparison, most of these words have the stylistic marker rude, disrespectful, insulting, and swearing. And for some reason, this study is pretty important. It may seem that it's just a consultation of word forming model, but the big question is what happens in the language in the future when, after the war, and it's already happening right now, we have lots of people with disabilities, physical disabilities. For example, loss of hearing, loss of sight because of injuries, and of course, limbs. What happens with our language in the future? Now we can just observe how conversational language reflects rude and violent attitude to these people. And we need to be careful about language models we use. and what modals are used by other people. I also made some references, a list of reference that we used, and maybe Maria wants to add something if
Yeah.
I'm not saying goodbye at this point.
I just want to say thank you. I just want to say that, as I mentioned before, future linguistic research could develop along the following lines. For example, it will be interesting to observe how the attitude towards those people with disabilities will be reflected in the word formation again, and in the semantics of the roots. One of the questions of this research, the future research, could be, will there be more new words created with neutral and positive meaning, including with using new roots and new suffixes, or the existing words will just change their meaning to become more positive and respectful? That's it. Thank you.
І дякую дуже пані Марії за
And
співпрацю.
thanks a lot, Maria, for that cooperation. That was extremely pleasant to work with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Oksana. Me too. Likewise.
Yeah, great job, great paper, wonderful material. We'll move now to our discussant. It's really an honor to welcome Natalia Kudryavtseva to discuss these three wonderful papers. I'll briefly introduce her. She is Dr. Nauk in Linguistics and Translation from the Taras Shevchenko National University. At the present, she is Professor of Translation and Slavic Studies at Kryvyi Rih State Pedagogical University. She's recently had a fellowship at, let me find this on your CV, at the Alfred Krupp Institute for Advanced Study in Greifswald, Germany, the Alfred Krupp Junior Fellowship. Dr. Kudryavtseva's research interests are in language policy, language ideologies, language revitalization, language socialization, social aspects of multilingualism. And as I mentioned before, she's a longtime friend of Indiana University and has done a lot of work with Deborah Friedman in our Department of Second Language Studies. So Natalia, wonderful to see you and really looking forward to your comments on these papers.
Thank you very much, dear Sarah. I am privileged, I'm happy and honored to take part in the Shevchenko conference for a third time already. And I consider that this has become a good tradition for me. And this time I'm taking a new role of a discussant, which makes me even happier. So the three studies reported on in this panel are of great interest and practicality. And it gives me great pleasure to suggest to you a discussion of their results and conclusions drawn in them. The papers touch upon different aspects of language. There is a paper describing the dynamics of language practices among Ukrainian youth based on data collected before and after the full-scale invasion, which shows a tendency toward a wider embrace of the Ukrainian language as caused by the full-blown war, while simultaneously also reveals that there are young people who balance Ukrainian and Russian in use, as well as those who still hold on to Russian, seeing it exclusively as a means of communication. Another paper examines the changes occurring in the structure of the Ukrainian language itself under the influence of Russia's war in Ukraine, and argues for the two major interdependent trends in the current development of Ukrainian, such as internationalization, realized as primarily as a bidirectional interaction between Ukrainian and English, and nationalization, expressed in an appeal to authentic symbols and classical Ukrainian literature, folklore, and so on. And yet another paper focuses on dialects of historically related Slavic languages and explores the labels used to denote people with disabilities in them. However different the papers may seem at first glance, they all exemplify one fundamental feature of language. And this is linguistic variation, accepted as the norm in applied language studies. When we accept variation as the norm, we understand language not so much as an abstract system of signs, but primarily as part of real life, as part of the human condition. This is what is suggested by work of many contemporary theorists, including Mikhail Bakhtin, who accounted for the social, cultural, cognitive, and biological factors responsible for linguistic variation by explicating a continuous tension between the so-called centripetal and centrifugal forces of language. The centripetal forces are various political, social, and institutional forces that try to impose one variety of code over the others. These are called centripetal because they try to force speakers toward adopting a unified linguistic identity. The centrifugal forces instead push speakers away from a common center and toward differentiation. These are the forces that tend to be represented by people geographically, numerically, economically, or metaphorically at the periphery of the social system. We see the manifestation of these centripetal forces of language in the growing shift towards exclusive use of the Ukrainian language among Ukrainian youth, as spurred by the force of the ongoing war. The same socio-political condition directs the tendency of nationalization in the system of the Ukrainian language, as examined in the first paper. The unity of various dialect denominations explored in the third paper is conditioned by the same origin, the Proto-Slavic language. The centrifugal forces of language account for the diversity that we see in the perceptions of Ukrainian and Russian revealed in the second study, as well in the various types of Ukrainian-Russian bilingualism. Those are the non-accommodating, accommodating, and passive types of bilingualism that speakers report on. The internationalization tendency in the development of the structure of the Ukrainian language is also the result of the centrifugal forces. It is the inclusion of English elements as well as Russianisms in the informal style into the system of Ukrainian, and the similar inclusion of Ukrainian elements into English, which testifies shifts away from the unified linguistic identity of both Ukrainian speakers and English speakers. Finally, the notion of dialect by itself suggests the idea of heteroglot language, which is captured in Bakhtin's notion of heteroglossia. And here it is important to remember that heteroglossia implies not only linguistic dialects in the strict sense of the word, but also, and this is more important for Bakhtin, languages that are socio-ideological. And we can clearly see that in the semantics of the labels for disabled people that the third paper explores, and I remind you that those are marked as pejorative indicators. Alternative norms produced by these centrifugal forces of language have been looked at by sociolinguists and linguistic anthropologists as strategies for the construction of social and cultural identities which deviate from those unified identities imposed by the centripetal forces. The focus on identity construction explicates the constitutive nature of speaking as a human activity and reveals how language arises as a social action. And I suggest this focus on language as a social action as a fruitful avenue for your future research. Another perspective you could take up is the framework of language ideologies, which would be especially relevant for the research presented in the second talk. These are also called linguistic ideologies or ideologies of language, and they are attitudes, opinions, beliefs, or views that all people have about language. People may or may not be conscious of them, and the most important thing is that all people have these beliefs or views of language as such, and of different particular languages. Two leading researchers in this field, Catherine Woolard and Bambi Schiffelin, define language ideologies as what people think or take for granted about language and communication. And they say that language ideologies can be seemingly neutral cultural conceptions of language, or they can be strategies maintaining social power and differentiation. I think that this approach would be especially useful for the second study, where the focus is namely on perceptions of Ukrainian and Russian found among young Ukrainian speakers, Russian speakers, and bilinguals. Such attitudes as purism and the view of language as a neutral means of communication have long been recognized to be these ideologies of language. This framework can also be utilized in the case of the first paper, where these beliefs and views of language are not so explicit, but implied. I should remind that ideologies concern not only the nature of language, as when people believe to be a language to be a marker of identity or a means of communication, but these ideologies also concern the structure and the use of language. And the structure of the Ukrainian language is the focus of the second paper. And the tendency there, this tendency of internationalization is obviously underpinned by the view of language as a neutral means of communication, whereby English borrowings are not perceived as marking any particular identity, but just serve to render certain information, to communicate certain meanings. The tendency of nationalization, with its appeal to the Ukrainian cultural heritage, foregrounds the function of language as a symbol of unique cultural identity, which is separate and distinctive. In the case of the third paper, the fact I find very interesting is that there are no dialectal units denoting a right-handed person, but plenty of those denoting a left-handed person. And this also might be the case for a language ideology, whereby there is a view that only deviations should be labeled in a dialect, but whatever perceived as normal or correct should not. This will be something to find out for the author, should she decide to follow, or should they decide to follow this approach. Thank you very much for your attention.
Natalia, thank you so much for these really helpful comments. I would love to give any of our presenters the opportunity to respond to your remarks, your critiques, your helpful suggestions. We don't have much time left, and we do, of course, want to let our interpreters and all of us take a short break before the next panel. But let's say we have about 8 minutes now for responses and possible to begin a discussion. So please, any of our presenters would like to jump in now.
Може, я тоді почну з вашого дозволу?
Maybe I can, take a floor, if you will. Thank you, Natalia, for this informative comments, and I agree with them all about our presentation about these different forces. You were right to say that. The only thing I would like to emphasize that these forces, these centrifugal forces, they also actualized in processes that denote that words that were on the periphery of our language framework, they are going towards the center of the language. And I think that's relevant for the third presentation as well, which Oksana said, how language is going to respond, because it will respond. Language will be affected by the war, and it will be affected by, I think, it will be also relevant for both forces and ideologies. That's a very good approach, and I think that's a good dimension. And I think that unfortunately we couldn't express it in the context of ideology of language because of lack of the time. We wanted to emphasize that this ideology, language as a protection, language as a weapon, even or language as Bayraktar, as in the article by Larysa Kysliuk. It's a very important influence, and we are implementing that direction, but that will be done in our following publication. Thank you for these comments. Yes, I can easily see that phenomenons, and even in my studies, this ideology is a really marker of identity. Some people say that I can't be in the trenches, but if I speak Ukrainian, I will somehow help the country to defend itself.
Ivanna, please.
Я б також хотіла подякувати.
I would also like to express my gratitude to Natalia for the comments, especially about language ideologies. That's true. The studies of language behavior cannot be done without studying language ideology. It's a part of our study. We just wanted to describe language behavior. It's a very hard thing to do in 15 minutes. So we just demonstrated the language with from our associative experiment, just like a single aspect of illustration. That's right. But it's more than just one table. There are more examples out there, and this topic needs a big study. Thanks for the comment. We will continue working in the same direction. Thanks a lot, Ivanna, for this study. And it's quite extensive. I have a question. Could you please describe the technical part of this study? What's the geography of your project? And what about your respondents? Where are they from? What oblast they're from? And I printed out this slide. I really liked it, about frequencies of use, like what, for example, what forms are more frequent for a Russian language or for Ukrainian language. Can you please explain that? Yeah. Speaking about geography, this short survey about associations, this associative experiment was done online, so geography is quite extensive. That was done for all different regions, including for IDPs. But if you compare IDPs, internally displaced people, we try to focus on people who moved from eastern regions of Ukraine, because we compared them with IDPs who came earlier during the beginning of the Russian invasion. So the general geography is basically us studying people who moved, who were displaced. And also we wanted to focus on people who not only moved from eastern regions, but also people who moved not only to Kiev, but only to the western Ukraine. And that happened in last year, especially. And it's a very hard thing to do because these respondents are very mobile. They moved last spring, but then at the end of the spring, they were on their way home. It's very hard to analyze the process, and sometimes we are comparing their language biographies, because doing statistics is a very hard thing to do, just because people come and go. And we are trying to collect as much material as possible so that we can digest it and analyze it. Speaking about frequencies of associations, that's true. As far as Ukrainian language is concerned, the association Ridna and Solovey are pretty frequent. People who consider Ukrainian language or Russian language as native. Ukrainian language for them is class, школа, or class school. That's the most frequent association. And Russian language is conversation or family. So the associations are very straightforward. Speaking about the Russian language, the most frequently people who think that their Ukrainian language is native, they think Russian language is related to enemy, death, and so on.
And in closing, I'll show another association of the Ukrainian language, which we have been supporting here at Indiana University. These buttons were made by the Summer Language Workshop, encouraging students to learn Ukrainian. So Mova Heroi, the language of heroes. So one more association. We'll have to close this session there. Oh, Masha, you have a comment.
Yes, I just want to thank Natalia. It's very great framing all this as language variation. I myself teach now language variation in the linguistics. And I think what is very interesting also for Ukrainian, the development of Ukrainian in that language in that sense is to see the correlation between the formal transformation of words and the meaning and the dialects, because what exactly suffixes will do, for example, to make them more positive for people who will be inevitably will come from the war as disabled. Will they use the same suffixes? Will they use different roots or different suffixes or create new ones? And that research can be very interesting. Thank you so much, Natalia. I enjoyed your comment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. And we will take a quick 5-minute break before we come back together at 10:30 Eastern Standard Time for our keynote address by Vitaly Chernetsky from the University of Kansas. I see Vitaly has just joined the meeting. Welcome, Vitaly. And Russell Valentino will be hosting that session. So see you all back here in 5 minutes. And thank you so much for attending this session.